Let's talk about ratios. Ratio is essentially just the difference between the highlight and the shadow. How much more light is there on one side than the other? And what it does is it's a powerful system because it gives you the ability, first of all, it's going to help you to visualize. It's going to help you to kind of understand what's going on with the light and what you're dealing with in a scene. But beyond that, it also allows you to communicate light. So let's say you're working in a studio environment or something like that and somebody's setting up lights. You can say, hey, set those up with a 2-to-1 ratio. Set those up with a 3-to-1 ratio. So it gives you control over communicating and just understanding what's going on with the light in relation to how much contrast you're going to have and what you're going to have to work with. So let's talk in simple terms about how ratios work. We could get all nerdy and get into the mathematical equations, and we should probably bring those up and look at them. But let's start with just the essentials. If you take a meter reading, if you have one stop difference in light, whether you're spot metering or you're using the camera thing and using the dial there in the camera, and let's say you have one more stop on this side than on this side, which in this light, I got a sun up here, I got clouds overhead, fairly flat light, but still some difference. There's about 2/3 to 1 stop difference right here if we were to meter this, depending on where the clouds are. But let's call it 1 stop for the sake of discussion. So if I have one more stop on this side than on this side, what do I have? There's twice as much light. Remember, an f-stop doubles the light each time, okay? So if I have one more on this side than this side, I have a 2-to-1 ratio. What if the sun comes out and I have twice as much, 2 stops more on this side than I do on this side? That's not a 2-to-1 ratio now. It's a 4-to-1 ratio, because remember, each stop doubles it, okay? So 1 stop more on this side is a 2-to-1 ratio, because a stop is twice as more. There's now twice as much light on this side than on this side, okay? 2 stops doubles it again. Now I have a 4-to-1 ratio. 3 stops, I would have an 8-to-1 ratio. So you can just keep doubling that way. Now, you have 1.5 stop. What is that? Well, 1 stop is a 2-to-1 ratio, okay? Another half stop, you just increase the light by 50% more. It's a 3-to-1 ratio now. So it's really pretty simple to be out in the field, take a reading, whether it be in the camera or with your meter, and say, all right, here's how much difference in light I have between this and this. And, sometimes you may actually say, okay, what's the ratio of that? Sometimes you may be satisfied with just knowing the stop difference. Hey, there's 2/3 of a stop difference between the shadow in the trees and the shadow on this side of the tree, or whatever it may be. There's a scenario when I was at White Sands, the way the light reflects there was hardly any contrast, even in the evening hours, in the morning hours, because the light was all reflecting off this white sand. So I might have like 1/3 of a stop difference. And it was shocking. I didn't even realize it was so small. So understanding, the difference between the highlight and the shadow and what that meant to my final image helped me to consider, okay, what am I going to have to do with this? How do I need to expose this? Where does the post-processing, how does that need to be done? And ultimately, I had to do some burning and dodging and control my contrast to define those edges a little bit in the image, because when you're standing there looking at it, my eyes perceive that shadow, but I had to make sure that the sculpting of that shadow came through. Shadows are really important. This is a common problem I see with newer photographers who might be working with portraits, is, you see these portraits and they're completely flat, and they may be pretty, but flat light is typically not the way to go. Now, I'm not trying to make rules here for how you have to do it, because everything is different. A lot of times with a portrait, a 2-to-1 ratio might be really good. That's, 2-to-1, 3-to-1, you're probably gonna get some really nice stuff with that. But there's not a set rule. But if you have no ratio in your light when you're working on a portrait, what's gonna happen is, first of all, it makes the subject feel fatter. It's going to make them appear fatter, which for some people is not as big of a deal as for others. But it's also going to be less depth and dimension. So maybe it's not a portrait, maybe it's a building. Shadows sculpt, they give dimension, they show angles, they show lines, and it's the same on a building or a landscape or someone's face. You can slim somebody using shadows on the face, using ratios, and have that sculpting light going around, show characteristics. On an extreme side, we've all seen classic portraits where it's super dark and shadow on one side and real light on the other. So, they may be getting into, 10-to-1 ratios. There's no restriction or limit to what you can do with ratios. So it's not that every image you go out and make, you need to say, oh, this is exactly the ratio of all these elements. Because if you're out there and you're visualizing and you're planning, or you're seeing in your zones and you're thinking about where your tone values are going to be, you're on the right track. But all these elements that we're talking about, the more of these little tools that you have in your kit, the better you're going to be able to understand and communicate light. So that's the basics of ratios. It's pretty straightforward, but let's stop. Let's go take a look at some examples. Let's look at some images, and maybe even take a look at a few of those mathematical equations, because there are some simple equations you can use to calculate ratio. I just kind of do it in my head. I say, hey, 1 stop more, 2-to-1, 2 stops more, 4-to-1, and that kind of thing. And I operate in f-stops because it's such a standardized system. An f-stop is always double the light, and then of course you can go in between f-stops, you can do partial f-stops. There's all this stuff you can do. But if you understand exposure value, equals X f-stop equals zone, they're all one-stop differences. And then that can equate to ratios. All this stuff ties together. And if you understand the increments of your f-stops and how to carry all that through, it's just going to make life easier. But let's look at some examples, and let's look at some different light ratios and talk about this a little bit more back in the studio.